Before we begin, let me ask you something. Where are you watching this from right now? Is it late at night, when the streets outside are quiet and shadows seem heavier than usual? Or is it in the middle of the day, when the world feels safe and you think men like Sam Giancana are just ghosts from another time? Because trust me, once you hear this story, you'll realize those shadows never really left. Chapter 1. The Puppet Master of Chicago. Sam Giancana's name doesn't echo in the public's imagination the way Al Capone's does. But that's the trick, isn't it? Capone was the flashy gangster, the brutal clown, a blunt instrument of prohibition. Giancana was something far more dangerous, a scalpel disguised as a silk tie, a mob boss who traded Tommy guns for telephones, bribery for ballots, bullets for contracts in Hollywood boardrooms. Born Salvatore Giancana in 1908 to Sicilian immigrants, he rose out of Chicago's Little Italy with the kind of cruelty that terrifies even other criminals. This wasn't a man who stumbled into crime. He was a strategist, a manipulator, a man who understood that in America, the ballot box could be hijacked as efficiently as a bank vault. By the 1950s, the FBI estimated Giancana controlled over 2,000 bookmakers, numbers rackets across Chicago, and skim operations from Las Vegas that brought in tens of millions annually. But money was never the endgame. It was the lever, the means to bend politics and entertainment into the mob's orbit. Now, here's where the story turns truly unsettling. Documents released decades later suggest Giancana's reach didn't just corrupt aldermen or city councils. It brushed against the Oval Office. In 1960, when John F. Kennedy ran against Richard Nixon, Chicago's Cook County became the battleground state within the battleground state. Allegations swirled that Giancana delivered tens of thousands of fraudulent votes, stuffing ballot boxes, intimidating union workers, and ensuring the Kennedy family's narrow victory in Illinois. Without Illinois, JFK may never have been president. Think about that for a moment. The trajectory of the Cold War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the space race, shaped, perhaps decided, by the hands of a Chicago gangster whose men once shook down corner bars for protection money. Conspiracy theorists insist that Joseph Kennedy, JFK's father, struck the deal personally with Giancana, promising protection for the mob in exchange for votes. Whether true or not, FBI wiretaps and Senate investigations later showed that Giancana spoke of "my friend Jack" with the kind of smugness only born of ownership. America had crowned a president, and the crown might have been delivered in an unmarked envelope from a smoky Chicago backroom. But politics was only one half of Giancana's empire. The other was Hollywood, the dream factory that manufactured America's fantasies. Giancana understood that film and music were the true engines of culture, more potent than machine guns or casinos. Through front men and union infiltration, his tendrils wrapped around the entertainment industry, the Screen Actors Guild, the projectionist unions, even film distribution channels. Rat Pack legends like Frank Sinatra weren't just friends. They were conduits. Sinatra's connections to the Kennedys and the mob were so notorious, the FBI kept entire volumes of files on his movements, his calls, his parties. Giancana dated singer Phyllis McGuire of the McGuire Sisters, flaunting their affair in Vegas showrooms. A reminder that even America's wholesome, golden-voiced darlings were not beyond mob fingerprints. Hollywood insiders whispered that scripts got greenlit or buried based on mob money, that casinos doubled as casting couches and punishment chambers, where a career could be ended with a word from Momo, Giancana's nickname. Here's the chilling implication. Giancana didn't just control crime. He controlled perception. By manipulating politicians on one side and entertainers on the other, he effectively shaped what America believed in and who America voted for. It wasn't just racketeering. It was narrative warfare. And the scariest part? The government knew. The CIA, in fact, didn't just know. They partnered with him. During the 1960s, when the U.S. plotted to assassinate Fidel Castro, it wasn't Navy SEALs or elite soldiers the government first turned to. It was Giancana. He provided hitmen, logistics, and connections to Cuba's underworld. The CIA believed the mob could reach Castro in ways the U.S. military never could. Think about that. The supposed defenders of democracy, outsourcing their dirtiest work to a gangster who was simultaneously rigging their elections. It wasn't two governments battling each other. It was two governments shaking hands in shadows. Hoover denied the mafia existed, but Langley was signing contracts with it. And Giancana stood at the nexus, laughing. A man who knew that in America, the line between patriot and criminal was drawn in disappearing ink. Chapter 2. Hollywood's Dark Stage. If politics was Giancana's chessboard, Hollywood was his stage play, a theater where the actors never knew who was really writing the script. By the 1960s, Las Vegas had already become the mob's cash register. But what most people didn't realize was that the mob's money didn't just skim chips off blackjack tables. It flowed into film studios, nightclubs, record labels, and broadcasting companies. Giancana saw something few mobsters did, that the American psyche wasn't built on laws or taxes, but on dreams flickering across silver screens. He understood that if you could control what people watched, who they adored, and which stars rose or fell, you weren't just a criminal king. You were the ghostwriter of the American myth. The story of Frank Sinatra is the perfect case study. Sinatra's career had cratered in the early 1950s, his voice weakening, his contracts drying up. Then, seemingly by miracle, he landed his Oscar-winning role in From Here to Eternity. But insiders whispered that Giancana leaned on studio bosses, forcing Sinatra back into the limelight. Whether true or not, Sinatra's resurgence coincided with his deepening ties to the Chicago outfit and his friendship with Giancana. Sinatra wasn't just a crooner anymore. He was a mob ambassador, a bridge between Hollywood, Vegas, and the White House. At Giancana's urging, Sinatra introduced the Kennedys to Marilyn Monroe, a move that created a triangle of power and peril that historians still debate. Monroe herself, entangled with both JFK and Robert Kennedy, became a liability when she died in 1962 of an overdose. Whispers ignited. Was it suicide, accident, or a silencing orchestrated to protect political dynasties and mob alliances? FBI memos show frantic monitoring of Sinatra, Monroe, and Giancana in those final weeks, suggesting that the government feared not just scandal, but collapse, the exposure of a shadow alliance too dangerous for daylight. Meanwhile, Giancana's reach extended into television. The 1960s were the golden age of the small screen, and mob-controlled unions determined which shows got distributed, which sets stayed open, and which stars found themselves blacklisted. Allegations emerged that Giancana's men forced producers to cast certain actors or finance certain projects in exchange for labor peace. In other words, if you wanted your cameras rolling, you paid the mob. Hollywood accountants later testified that up to 10% of studio payrolls in some years were skimmed through consulting fees tied to Giancana's fronts. That's not corruption on the edges. That's systemic control. Imagine turning on your TV in 1965 and realizing the sitcom Laughing in Your Living Room carried fingerprints from a gangster in Chicago. But the darkest part wasn't the money. It was the silence. Stars who crossed Giancana didn't just lose contracts. They disappeared. Some died in mysterious car accidents, others from sudden health problems. Studio executives who spoke against mob infiltration found their families threatened. The entertainment press, often owned or influenced by syndicate-linked publishers, conveniently ignored these patterns. Instead, gossip columns pushed fluff about Giancana's romance with Phyllis McGuire, framing it as a glamorous scandal, rather than what it was, evidence that America's most wholesome institutions were entwined with its dirtiest underworld. Behind the neon and applause, Hollywood had become a hostage, and here's the horror that lingers. Giancana wasn't just rigging elections or showbiz contracts. He was rigging reality itself. He blurred the line between politician and actor, between public servant and celebrity puppet. In his world, JFK was as much a performer as Sinatra, and Monroe was as expendable as a Union thug on the docks. America in the 1960s believed it was watching democracy and entertainment unfold naturally, when in truth, It was watching Giancana's script play out, scene by scene. A mob boss in Chicago dictating the dreams and leaders of 180 million people. It's not just frightening. It's the kind of nightmare that makes you wonder how much of history was ever real, and how much of it was just another performance directed by men like Sam Giancana. Chapter 3. The CIA Connection. By the early 1960s, Sam Giancana was no longer just a gangster. He was something far stranger. A hybrid creature stitched together from the sins of democracy and the shadows of espionage. To the public, the mafia and the CIA seemed like opposites. One a criminal empire, the other a government agency sworn to protect freedom. But history, once you scrape off the official paint, shows them as mirror images. Both secretive, both ruthless, both willing to bend or break the law in the name of survival. And in the murk of the Cold War, when the United States was clawing at any weapon to halt communism's spread, those two empires met in the darkness and shook hands. The CIA's obsession was Fidel Castro, the cigar-smoking lawyer who had embarrassed Washington by taking Cuba at gunpoint and nationalizing American-owned casinos, hotels, and plantations. Those casinos weren't just tourist traps. They were mob cash registers, pumping out millions in skimmed profits for bosses like Giancana and Santo Trafficante. When Castro slammed the doors shut, he didn't just spit in America's face. He ripped the heart out of the mafia's offshore empire. So the CIA, desperate to kill Castro, but unwilling to stain its hands with another Bay of Pigs disaster, turned to the men who had once owned Havana, the mob. Documents declassified in the 1990s confirmed the unholy marriage. The CIA's Directorate of Plans, its Cloak and Dagger division, approached Giancana and Trafficante, offering contracts for assassination. The plan was simple in outline, grotesque in execution. Mob hitmen would poison Castro's food, his cigars, even his wetsuit. Giancana, flush with both rage and ambition, agreed eagerly, not because he cared about democracy or communism, but because revenge was profitable. If Castro fell, the casinos reopened, the money flowed, and Giancana's influence stretched from Chicago to Havana once more. Some accounts suggest Giancana even bragged to his mistress, Phyllis McGuire, that he had the U.S. government in his pocket, using him like their #1 contractor. Imagine the irony. The same government that declared war on organized crime was handing envelopes of cash to its most notorious boss, trusting him with state secrets, entrusting him with operations that could tip the balance of the Cold War. But here's the twist. Giancana didn't deliver. Despite multiple plots, Castro lived. CIA operatives later admitted that their mafia partners were often unreliable, distracted by personal vendettas, or simply playing both sides for cash. And Giancana, never one to waste a good opportunity, allegedly used the CIA's interest as leverage. Some historians argue that he dangled promises of progress on Castro while simultaneously blackmailing politicians, reminding them that if his role ever leaked, America's credibility would collapse overnight. Think about that terror, a mobster with the power to reveal that America had outsourced regime change to gangsters. The Kennedy administration, already wobbling from the Bay of Pigs fiasco, would have imploded under the weight of that scandal. Which raises a darker speculation. Did the Kennedys turn on him first? Because while Giancana played the role of CIA assassin, Robert F. Kennedy, then Attorney General, declared open war on organized crime. His Justice Department launched more indictments against mob figures in 3 years than Hoover had in 3 decades. And Giancana, once the kingmaker, suddenly found himself hunted. Was this betrayal, a double cross by the Kennedys after they had used him to steal an election? Or was it cold strategy? The government cleaning up loose ends before they exposed too much. The tension built like a Greek tragedy, with Giancana at its bloody center. The CIA needed him, but RFK wanted him destroyed. And in the middle stood JFK himself, publicly crusading against corruption, while privately entangled with Sinatra, Monroe, and the very mob boss who claimed to have put him in the White House. The contradictions were impossible, unsustainable, and in that contradiction lay the seeds of conspiracy. whispers that the assassination of JFK in 1963 was not just the act of a lone gunman, but a collision of betrayed allies, mobsters, spies, and rogue government men, erasing a liability who knew too much. Whether true or not, the fact remains. Sam Giancana, the Chicago gangster, had once been trusted with the fate of nations, and that is a horror no amount of official denial can erase. Chapter 4. The Blood Oath of Silence. By the mid-1960s, Sam Giancana's empire was cracking. The CIA had stopped calling. RFK's Justice Department had buried him under surveillance. And Hoover, finally forced to acknowledge the mafia's existence, unleashed wiretaps and bugs that stripped away the mob's armor of secrecy. But here's the paradox. The more cornered Giancana became, the more dangerous he was. He knew too much. He had spoken too freely. He carried in his head a map of America's shadow government, where mob money touched politics, where CIA secrets bled into mafia deals, where Hollywood dreams covered for extortion. For a man like that, silence was survival. But history shows us that silence is never permanent. Eventually, someone always talks, and Giancana, perhaps more than anyone, was a man the mob and the government both feared might talk. In 1975, years after slipping in and out of exile in Mexico, Giancana was subpoenaed to testify before the Church Committee, the Senate hearings that were tearing open the CIA's darkest closets. He was expected to answer questions about assassination plots, about Cuba, about the CIA's use of mobsters. For the first time in decades, the carefully constructed wall of silence was cracking. America was about to hear, live, on the record, what it looked like when democracy hired killers from the underworld. But Giancana never made it to the stand. So days before his scheduled testimony, he was shot 7 times in his Oak Park home. Once in the back of the head, 6 more in the mouth. The traditional Sicilian symbol for a man who talked too much. The message was unmistakable. The mob doesn't forgive betrayal. But who ordered it? Some believe it was the outfit itself, tying off loose ends before the Senate spotlight turned lethal. Others whisper darker theories, that intelligence operatives, terrified Giancana would expose the CIA mob alliance, arrange the hit themselves, outsourcing the kill just as they had outsourced so many before. The fact that no one was ever charged, that evidence mysteriously vanished, that investigators described the crime scene as too clean, only deepens the suspicion. Giancana's death was not just a murder, it was a ritual erasure, the silencing of a man who straddled 2 worlds and threatened both. And yet, even in death, he refused to vanish completely. His name appeared again and again in conspiracy books about JFK, about Marilyn Monroe, about Castro. His FBI file, thousands of pages thick, remains a labyrinth of redactions and missing documents. Hollywood continued to make films inspired by his life, thinly disguised stories that hinted at truths too explosive to state openly. And Chicago still bears his fingerprints, in union contracts, in whispered family names, in the political machine that outlived him. The true horror of Giancana's story is not that he was killed, but that his killing solved nothing. It didn't end mob influence. It didn't erase CIA corruption. It didn't clarify the past. Instead, it reinforced a terrifying lesson, that when secrets become too heavy, men like Giancana are not imprisoned, they are executed, and the silence left behind is more dangerous than the truth ever could have been. To this day, historians argue over who really pulled the trigger, who gave the order, who cleaned the scene. But the real answer is simpler, scarier. It wasn't a single man. It was the system itself. A system that could not allow Sam Giancana to speak. A system that devours its own when the secrets get too loud. Chapter 5. The Death of Monroe and the Shadow Triangle. Marilyn Monroe's death in August 1962 is still officially stamped as probable suicide, but in the underworld where Sam Giancana operated, official stamps meant nothing. To those who knew the machinery of power, her overdose was less a tragedy than a message. a warning written in pills and whispers. Monroe was not just Hollywood's goddess. She was the connective tissue in a triangle of power that stretched from mob backrooms to Camelot itself. Her affairs with both John F. Kennedy and Robert Kennedy placed her at the center of the most explosive secret of the era, that the President of the United States and his Attorney General were entangled with a woman who also moved within Giancana's orbit. Sinatra introduced her to the Kennedys. Sinatra answered to Giancana. And Giancana, well, he answered to no one. Here's the sinister truth. Monroe had begun to talk. Her diaries, which later vanished, allegedly contained references to government secrets. Cuba, nuclear weapons, private meetings she overheard in moments of careless intimacy. She confided in friends that she felt used, discarded, and in danger. And danger she was. In the weeks before her death, FBI memos tracked her calls, monitored her movements. Wiretap reports, still partly redacted, suggest she reached out to journalists, threatening to hold a press conference that would shock the world. The Kennedys, already stretched thin between the Cuban Missile Crisis and RFK's crusade against organized crime, could not afford scandal. And Giancana? He couldn't afford exposure. Monroe's mouth was a liability to both empires. The night she died, witnesses reported strange phone calls, shadows at her house, men who vanished before police arrived. The Los Angeles coroner's office bungled the investigation, losing tissue samples and misreporting timelines. Photographs disappeared. The crime scene was scrubbed. And just like that, America's most famous starlet was gone. Officially, a victim of her own loneliness. Unofficially, perhaps the most famous casualty of the secret war between Giancana, the Kennedys, and the CIA. And isn't it chilling to think? Monroe wasn't killed because she was fragile. She was killed because she knew too much. Giancana's fingerprints were everywhere, even if invisible. Sinatra panicked. His relationship with the Kennedys strained. His allegiance to Giancana questioned. RFK distanced himself, but whispers never faded, that Giancana orchestrated Monroe's silencing as both a favor and a warning, reminding the Kennedys that their power was not absolute, that the mob had ways of enforcing silence. Whether the order came from the outfit, from intelligence operatives, or from a desperate Kennedy loyalist, the outcome was the same. Marilyn Monroe, the golden face of American dreams, became another name on Giancana's hidden ledger, a ledger where glamour and blood mixed until you couldn't tell them apart. The shadow triangle. Giancana, the Kennedys, Monroe, collapsed that summer, but its aftershocks never ended. JFK dead in Dallas the following year. RFK gunned down in Los Angeles in 1968. Giancana silenced in Chicago in 1975. 3 corners of the same cursed triangle, erased one by one, as if the universe itself demanded balance for the sins they carried. And through it all, Hollywood kept rolling. Presidents kept swearing oaths. Casinos kept ringing. The show went on. But those who knew the story whispered that the show was rigged, that the stage lights were powered not by dreams, but by deals written in blood. Sam Giancana's body was lowered into the earth in 1975, riddled with bullets, his mouth sewn shut with lead. But you don't bury a man like Giancana. You bury evidence. You bury loose ends. And you bury the possibility of truth. His murder was never solved because it wasn't meant to be solved. Whether the outfit executed him for betrayal, or the CIA erased him to protect its secrets, or the Kennedys' remaining allies tied off the last knot in a frayed conspiracy, the result was the same. Silence. A silence deeper than Hoover's denials, heavier than RICO indictments. A silence that said to anyone listening, the war between shadows and governments is eternal, and you will never know its true script. Yet Giancana lingers. His story lives in FBI files, blacked out by thick marker, in Hollywood films too close to reality, in Las Vegas casinos rebuilt on bones, in conspiracy theories whispered across decades, and the questions refuse to die. Did Giancana make JFK president? Did he help kill him after betrayal? Was Monroe silenced to protect both the mob and the state? Did the CIA hire the outfit to topple Castro, only to be betrayed in return? Each answer is swallowed in shadows, each shadow birthing more questions. The deeper you dig, the less you see. That is Giancana's true legacy. Not just corruption, not just power, but the architecture of confusion itself. He built a labyrinth so intricate that even today, historians, agents, and mobsters wander its halls without finding the exit. And maybe that's the point. Maybe Giancana's greatest trick was not fixing elections or controlling Hollywood, but convincing America that it could never truly separate fact from fiction, democracy from crime, hero from villain. The mob boss became a ghostwriter of history, ensuring that every page turned led not to clarity, but to fog. And when you stare long enough into that fog, you realize the most terrifying truth of all. The story isn't over, because the machinery Giancana built didn't die with him. Politicians still rise on invisible money. Hollywood still runs on secret deals. Intelligence agencies still shake hands with criminals when it suits their needs. His skeleton is everywhere, hidden in plain sight, dressed now in modern suits and digital masks. The face of Sam Giancana may be gone, but the shadow of Sam Giancana, his methods, his alliances, his silence, still rules from behind the curtain. So the curtain falls on Giancana's life. The audience applauds, the actors bow, the play ends. But as the lights dim, you hear something unsettling in the empty theater. A voice in the dark, low, amused, whispering in a Chicago accent, "The show never ends, kid. It just changes actors." And that's when you realize you're not watching history. You're living in Giancana's script.